So hello, everyone. I'll start also by thanking Wendy, as well as the other conference organizers, the people, the boots on the ground here, for inviting me and hosting me this weekend. I've learned so much over the course of this weekend, and I'm enjoying being in conversation with all of you, so I'm hoping that you'll ask whatever questions arise for you about what I have to say today. The title of my talk is simply Risk. It's part of a larger work in progress that's focused in part on what thinking the spatio-temporality of digital media in relationship to that which today can be understood under the politicized rubric of blackness offers to theorizations of risk and speculation, as those might be understood in the present phase of capitalist accumulation. In order to anchor my thoughts today about the relationship between digital media, finance capital, blackness, and risk and speculation, I invite you to watch the beginning of this music video by Nick Hooker. And it's from a 2008 song by Grace Jones called Corporate Cannibal. So first, for those of you who are unfamiliar with Grace Jones, it's worth noting that she has been an active, if controversial, contributor to disco and later dance music since 1977. She's controversial for the ways she participates in and an aesthetic fetishization of blackness. She also is controversial for her penchant for wearing men's clothes and creating confusion as to her gender identity. So this is the beginning, then, of Corporate Cannibal.
Pleased to meet you. Pleased to have you on my plate. Your meat is sweet to me. Your destiny, your fate. You're my life support. Your life is my sport. I'm a man. Eating machine. I'm a man eating machine. You won't hear me laughing as I terminate your day. You can't trace my footsteps as I walk the other way. I can't get enough prey. Eating machine for me. Pray for me. A corporate cannibal, digital criminal. I'm a corporate cannibal, a corporate cannibalized criminal, digital criminal, corporate cannibal. Eat you like an animal.
So Grace Jones's song and video for Corporate Cannibal menacingly stitch a meditation on digital media aesthetics, Grace Jones's body, and the volatility of the frame, to a narrative of capital, about capital's ability to capture and devour whatever it encounters, taking it into its body, which is here also Grace Jones's electronic morphine body, a self-proclaimed man-eating machine. This video dramatizes capital's generative ability to animate objects and forms, incorporating them into a rhythmic body machine of desires and appetites. Stephen Shaviro offers a masterful engagement with this video and the thought it facilitates. My own thinking with Corporate Cannibal is in dialogue with his. Shaviro presents Hooker's video as exemplary of what he calls post-cinematic affect. And he describes the video's artistic production process as follows. And I notice You already started reading this, which is good. And I also want to just apologize, because for the next several slides, it's just some text on screen. So if you don't have to follow along, feel free not to. Okay, so this is Steven Shaviro. Nick Hooker's video for Grace Jones's Corporate Cannibal is in black and white. Or, more precisely, it is just in black. The only images that appear on the screen are those of Grace Jones's upper face and upper body. These images were captured by 2 video cameras in a single take. The director recalls that at the time of the shoot, Jones had spent considerable time, several months in Jamaica. Oh, sorry, this is not the thing. You're still with me though, right? Okay. I got confused by not seeing my screen here. It's okay. Okay, so she had spent several months in Jamaica. As a result, her skin was intensely black, like dark black. There is no background to contrast with the black of Jones's figure or with what Hooker calls, quote, the raw glow of her skin, end quote. The video was actually shot in color with a white wall for background, but in post-production, the director desaturated the footage and brought up the contrast which made the white wall fall away entirely and consequently enhanced the blackness of her skin. As a result of this treatment, there is literally nothing in the video aside from Jones's skin, her features, and her silhouette. Behind her, there's only an empty blankness. It is the absence of any image whatsoever that we see as white. So while Shaviro recognizes that this visual schema has racial implications, the more interesting line of thinking to follow here has to do with what it allows him to say about societies of control. Shaviro explains, and this is what you see now on the screen, Corporate Cannibal is about modulation. Modulation requires an underlying fixity in the form of a carrier wave or a signal that is made to undergo a series of controlled and coded variations. The modulations of Corporate Cannibal imply that no matter what happens, it can always be contained in advance within a predetermined set of possibilities. Everything is drawn into the same fatality, the same narrowing funnel, the same black hole. There is no proliferation of meanings, but rather a capture of all meanings. Every event is translated into the same binary code and placed within the same algorithmic grid of variations, the same phase space. And he continues, if it thereby exemplifies and internalizes or miniaturizes modulation as the central mechanism of what Gilles Deleuze calls the emerging control society. Modulation works, Deleuze says, quote, like a self-transmuting, molding, continually changing from one moment to the next, or like a sieve whose mesh varies from one point to another. The end of the quote from Deleuze. So, continuing here with Shaviro, he points out that, quote, of course modulation is not just a special feature of Corporate Cannibal, it is a basic characteristic of digital processes in general, end quote. So this observation allows Shaviro to incorporate insights into societies of control into his thinking with and through Corporate Cannibal. So I hope that this audience might forgive me for assuming that you already have some knowledge of control societies. Because Deleuze's formulation of them are actually somewhat peripheral to my main interest this afternoon, and I want to sort of stay on track here. So for now, it's enough just to point out that Deleuze describes the common linguistic logics of the spaces of enclosure. Now you can't control that right now, I'm pretty sure. Okay, so for now is enough to point out that Deleuze describes the common linguistic tropes, logics of the spaces of enclosure characteristic of control societies as analogical. In distinction to those, Deleuze says that the language of modulation, the controls about which Shaviro reminds us, or a system of variable geometry, is numerical. And Deleuze clarifies that numerical here does not necessarily mean binary. So this clarification is important in the context of my thinking about Corporate Cannibal, of my thinking with Corporate Cannibal, because it leads away from a strict attention to the ones and zeros of binary code and any presumptions about what that code has to do with the purported content of the video, and towards avenues for thinking algorithms, measurement, processes of commensuration, and programmed visions. Corporate Cannibal offers a conceptualization of blackness that prompts a confrontation with the relationships between blackness and wealth, as those become perceptible not only through calculation and measurement, but also through incommensuration and opacity. And it is in this constellation, seething within and through the modulations of control, that I think something like blackness lies in wait. Laying in wait is spatiotemporal. To claim that blackness lies in wait within the modulations of control asks that we expand the temporal arc through which we engage digital media, financialization, and control societies. I think that Corporate Cannibal helps us to grasp, yet again, that what can be perceived as in Shaviro's words, quote, radically new ways of manufacturing and articulating lived experience, end quote, might also be the reinvigoration and deployment of older ways of manufacturing and articulation, articulating the lived experience of blackness, making that experience more broadly perceptible and perhaps more widely distributed and felt. So I want to be clear about two things here. First, when I talk about blackness in this context, I am referring something that is more than what we usually mean in the United States when we say race, and something quite different than what I think people outside the United States think those of us in the United States mean when we say race, right? So I think that blackness, when I say blackness here, I'm thinking about both Fred Moten's question, quote, what is it to be an irreducibly disordering, deformational force, while at the same time being absolutely indispensable to normative order, normative form, end quote from Moten. And I'm thinking as well as, for example, German intellectual Fatima El-Taib's efforts in her book, European Others, Queering Ethnicity in Post-National Europe, to revive a different geography of blackness by insisting on anchoring it in local relations and histories at the same time as it participates in an anti-racist transnational political formation. El-Taib explains, and this is from her, the focus on the transatlantic slave trade lets diasporic populations who have entered the West through different trajectories necessarily appear as less representative of the black condition. Accordingly, African diaspora studies have so far overwhelmingly focused on the black experience in the Americas, and the methodological framework developed to grasp the particulars of that situation cannot necessarily be applied to other parts of the world. It can offer, however, an important foundation for further explorations of black communities, including those in continental Europe, who so far play little role in transnational diaspora studies precisely because of their divergence from the US norm. End of quote from El-Taib. El-Taib's significant intervention and contribution is an invitation to open conceptualizations of blackness by anchoring those in the specificity of locations outside of the United States. At the same time, El-Taib's European Others builds on bodies of work that themselves are animated by a transnational impulse, such as women of color feminism and Pan-Africanism. With this in mind, my formulation of that blackness lies in wait within the modulations of control suggests something like the dispersed mobile agent with which Beth Coleman ends her essay, Racist Technology. Geographically dispersed and temporally agile, blackness is simultaneously incorporated into, right, the logics and flows of capital, while at the same time remaining within it as this sort of irreducibly disruptive force. So in Spectres of the Atlantic, Finance, Capital, Slavery, and the Philosophy of History, Ian Balcombe argues that the current conjuncture is one in which the historically determinate social relationships between masters and slaves and colonizers and colonized rise to prominence as a particular form of mediation characteristic of finance capitalism. So part of what I want to do here by moving to Bauckham is to say that while this move is putting sort of the Middle Passage back into the conversation, right? It's doing so in an effort to also understand the extent to which what we are experiencing in terms of financialization has a kind of other prior moment that has been located by a couple of other authors in the slave trade, right? So this is at least to my mind, still thinking with El-Taib about this. Okay. So Bauckham puts it this way, quote, as commodity capital is to the 19th century's intensification of the 17th, so finance capital is to the long 20th century's intensification of the 18th, end quote. Bauckham focuses on the slave ship Zong and its 1781 voyage, during which enslaved Africans were dumped overboard, so that instead of selling those Africans into slavery, the slavers and the Liverpool merchants involved in the transatlantic slave trade could collect the insurance on them as lost property. Presenting the Zong voyage as emblematic of the logics of the social character of finance capital, Bauckham argues that in Britain during the 18th century, the evidence of a slave trade shows up belatedly, and he explains. And this is a rather long quote, but bear with me. Right? The evidence came later, after a voyage was complete, after the slaves had been sold, after the record keeping, the account adjusting, and the other work of documentation upon which the historians rely for their own imaginary reconstruction of events. But the value already existed prior to and independent of the evidence that what was valued, in fact, existed. Time and distance are part of the explanation. The time it took to complete the vast triangular circuit of the trade dictated that merchants must conduct much of their business on credit. But for such a system of credit to operate, both a theory of knowledge and a form of value which would secure the credibility of the system itself had to be in place. Central to that theory was a mutual and system-wide determination to credit the existence of imaginary values. Central to that form of value was a reversal of the protocols of value creation proper to commodity capitalism. For here, value does not follow, but precedes exchange. Not, to be sure, as the classical Marxist account has it, in the form of that use value that is held to pre-exist the moment of exchange, but as what Marx understood to be the end product rather than the originary moment of capital, as money value, value in the guise of the general equivalent. Such value exists not because a purchase has been made and goods have exchanged, but because two or more parties have agreed to believe in it. Exchange here does not create value. It retrospectively confirms it, offers belated evidence to what already exists. Okay, so that's a long quote by Bauckham. Evidence from the Zong massacre reveals that the economy of the transatlantic slave trade was a speculative one, predicated on the belief that the future would confirm the present value of slaves and other commodities of the trade. Bauckham's analysis helps us to understand that certain of today's forms of finance capitalism intensify a speculative economy entrenched during the slave trade. The spatio-temporal logics and the socio-political relationships imagined as part of the slave economy are mapped differently today, but the general logics and material relations remain present. While commodity capitalism continues to be mediated by labor relations, it still is accompanied by, and in certain contexts eclipsed by, finance capitalism, which is mediated by various relations of precarity. Right? And we can talk a bit more about this because I think it's come up in different ways throughout this conference. The African slave trade of the 16th and 19th centuries and the colonized subjects of the 16th through 21st centuries are sedimented within present relations of precarity, haunting them in different ways in different settings. The crisis of value that the financial derivative today resolves, however clumsily, extends back through centuries of temporal accumulation, piling up on the bodies of Africans and of indigenous peoples, some of whom are Black and/or African, present in modernity's most violent scenes of exchange. Computation still meets flesh and culture in Blackness. Y'all still with me here? Yeah. So in cinema and media studies, the rise of digital technologies, generally conceptualized as technologies of mediation, is being assessed and analyzed in a variety of ways, including, among other approaches, formulations of the death of cinema, an attendant eclipse of film studies, or cinema studies by media studies, a relative indifference to, or alternatively, a heightened interest in the difference the specific medium of mediation makes, an incorporation of science and technology studies into media studies, and the development of new media studies as a subfield within media studies. Yeah? Analyses and theories of the specific role played by computation in digital media are of particular interest here because they assist in situating how digital cultural productions interface with the processes of computation and calculation on which digital technologies rely. Where digital cultural productions such as films, music, and digital art interface with computations and calculations through which digital technologies and those through which finance capital function, contemporary demands for commensuration amidst various crises of capital might be challenged through an insistence on what Edouard Glissant has referred to as a right to opacity. As it has been formulated in Glissant's oeuvre, opacity names a politicized cultural strategy. I understand opacity to be part of Glissant's philosophy of relation calibrated to secure an investment in Black futures, which may not look like an investment at all, through reliance on a queer temporality. For Glissant, opacity is a mode through which one or a group of living beings might resist Western thought's requirements for transparency. Glissant explains that from the perspective of Western thought, quote from Glissant, "In order to understand and thus accept you, I have to measure your solidarity with the ideal scale, providing me with grounds to make comparisons and perhaps judgments. I have to reduce," end of quote from Glissant. He suggests that, quote, that perhaps, quote, "we need to bring an end to the very notion of a scale, displace all reduction," end quote. To insist upon a group's right to opacity in sociocultural terms, therefore, is to challenge the processes of commensuration built into the demand for that group to become perceptible according to existing conceptions of the world. It is a way of asserting the existence of another world in this world, another conception of the world in this world, incomprehensible perhaps from within the common senses that secure existing hegemonic relations and their computations of relative value. Elsewhere, I've described cinematic images as images of value and process. If, as I argue there, cinematic images index existing relations in ways that most often make perceptible common sense as the content of those images, then the eclipse of celluloid by digital video and the attendant collapse of any claim to what film theorists have referred to as profilmic reality reveals that the so-called crises of the index in the digital regime of the image is merely an intensification of a crisis that has been constitutive of cinematic reality since the invention of cinema, namely the unmooring of an appearance from its material referent. What was perceptible as a particular crisis of the image, the failure of images of Black people to empirically and positively represent Black people, for example, has become a general crisis of representation that is showing up today because digital media is indifferent to the truth claims undergirding appeals to profilmic reality. The specific conditions of corporate cannibals production mean that, as Shaviro points out, quote, that Grace Jones's figure is a complex, aggregated, and digitally coded electronic signal, end quote, rather than a photochemical trace that indexes the fact that something was once in front of the camera. So in Corporate Cannibal, and this is, again, another quote, Nick Hooker does not manipulate Jones's image so much as he modulates and actively recomposes the electronic signals that she already is, and whose interplay defines the field of her becoming. Jones embodies Capital Unbound precisely because she has become a pure electronic pulse. Just as the groundless figures of digital video are no longer tied to any indexical reference, so too the endlessly modulating financial flows of globalized network capitalism are no longer tied to any concrete processes of production. Shaviro and others read the situation as one in which there is cause for despair, because it means the future already has been premeditated for us, to use Richard Gerson's word, or premediated for us. He invokes, Shaviro invokes Deleuze from the Control Society's essay, saying that a man is no longer a man confined, but a man in debt. And he claims that in the face of a foreclosure on the future, we are experiencing a fundamental failure of the imagination because we don't seem to be able to come up with anything concrete that would be independent of the logic of financial flows. Maybe so. Wait. I mean, yes, sir, of course, these certainly are queer times. And yet, still, seething within the modulations of control, undulating this way and that, participating and making a contribution, like Toussaint Louverture, The Opening, in an earlier phase of financial speculation and capital accumulation, blackness lies in wait. Thank you.